Hey everyone, this is one of those stories that doesn't ask for your attention politely, it demands it. Before we go any further, take a second to like this story, subscribe if you believe in comebacks that shake the ground, and welcome to Black Queen Dominion, where survival turns into power and silence becomes strategy. This story began on a night that smelled like rain and endings. I was 16, standing at the edge of a life that was never really mine to begin with. Childhood had already taught me how to stay quiet, how to fold myself smaller, how to read moods instead of books. But that night was different. That night I was no longer a burden to be tolerated. I was a problem to be removed. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final explanation that could later be replayed for closure. The decision had been made long before I understood it. Adults had weighed convenience against responsibility and chosen the lighter option. By the time I realized what was happening, I was already standing outside the circle of belonging. Home had become a locked concept, not a place. The world does something strange when you are abandoned young. It sharpens. Every sound feels louder, every silence heavier. I learned very quickly that sympathy does not pay rent and tears do not keep you warm. At 16, the system does not see a child. It sees paperwork. I moved through couches, shelters, temporary kindness that always came with an expiration date. Each place taught me the same lesson in different words. Do not get comfortable. School became a background noise rather than a promise. Hunger was more consistent than hope. I learned how to stretch $1 into a meal and a smile into a shield. I watched other teenagers complain about curfews and phone upgrades, and I realized how invisible pain becomes when it doesn't fit the expected shape. Nobody wants to hear a story that makes them uncomfortable, especially when they feel absolved by not causing it directly. There were nights when the weight of being unwanted pressed so hard on my chest that breathing felt optional. But something stubborn lived inside me, something that refused to disappear quietly. It wasn't optimism. It wasn't faith. It was defiance. If I was going to vanish, it would not be on their terms. I started working wherever work could be found. Cleaning jobs, late shifts, anything that exchanged time for survival. Exhaustion became familiar, almost comforting. When you are tired enough, memories lose their edge. I kept my head down and my future vague. Dreams felt dangerous, like tempting the universe to laugh again. Years passed not as milestones but as endurance tests. I aged out of pity faster than I aged into opportunity. So I watched, listened, and learned. I learned how power moves quietly. I learned how money speaks louder than explanations. I learned that the people who abandon you often assume you will stay exactly where they left you. By my early 20s, I was no longer surviving day to day. I was building something small but solid. Education came later, stitched together through night classes and borrowed time. Every certificate felt like a brick laid against the storm. I didn't announce my progress. I didn't update anyone. Silence became my protection. What they didn't know was that being left behind had stripped away my fear of starting from nothing. I had already been there. Failure no longer scared me. Dependence did. I chose paths that rewarded discipline over connections, resilience over charm. Slowly the world began to respond. Opportunities multiplied when preparation met timing. A small business idea turned into a profitable venture. Profits turned into investments. Investments turned into independence. I didn't become rich overnight. I became untouchable slowly, deliberately, and without witnesses. And then, just as quietly as they had disappeared, my past began to stir. Names I hadn't spoken in years surfaced through second-hand channels. Casual inquiries disguised as concern floated in my direction. I felt it before I confirmed it. The gravitational pull of success had reached the very people who once cut me loose. They had noticed the movement, the growth, the absence of need. Success rarely announces itself with fireworks. For me, it arrived as quiet stability. Bills paid without panic. Mornings without dread. Choices that were no longer dictated by desperation. That kind of success changes how you walk through the world. It straightens your spine. It slows your breath. And somehow, even without invitations or announcements, it sends a signal. The first sign came indirectly. A distant relative mentioned my name in passing, surprised at where I had landed. Another connection reached out under the guise of networking. None of them said what they really meant. They never do. They circled the truth, careful not to disturb the past too directly. I stayed observant. Silence had taught me patience, and patience had taught me power. I didn't rush to correct assumptions or share details. I let curiosity do the work for me. People reveal their intentions when they think they are in control of the conversation. What became clear was this: my success disrupted a story they had been telling themselves for years. In that story, I was a cautionary tale, a regrettable but necessary sacrifice. I was supposed to struggle indefinitely, validating their choice. My existence was meant to be proof that they had done what they had to do. But now, evidence suggested otherwise. The idea that I had built a life without them was unsettling. The idea that I had built a better one was intolerable. Guilt began to morph into opportunity. Regret disguised itself as reconciliation. They weren't reaching out because they missed me. They were reaching out because I no longer fit comfortably into their narrative. I felt the shift before any direct contact was made. Old family spaces suddenly felt smaller, more fragile. The authority they once held over my identity had expired, and they knew it. People who abandon you often expect to be forgiven automatically if they ever return. They confuse time passed with accountability served. By the time the first message arrived, I was ready. Not emotionally eager, not bitter, just prepared. Years of self-reliance had taught me to evaluate people the way I evaluated investments. By patterns, not promises. They spoke of concern, of wondering, of hoping I had turned out okay. The phrasing was careful, designed to minimize responsibility and maximize access. There was no acknowledgement of the night I was left behind, only a vague sense of distance that had somehow occurred on its own. I didn't respond immediately. Power grows in pauses. I watched how the outreach expanded when silence met expectation. More messages followed, warmer in tone, heavier in implication. There was talk of family, of reconnecting, of making up for lost time. There was also an unspoken calculation happening beneath the surface. They had heard about my success. Not the details, but enough to know it mattered. Enough to know it could change things. For them. What they didn't understand was that success had not softened me. It had clarified me. I no longer needed approval to feel complete, and I no longer feared withdrawal of support. I had built a life where access to me was a privilege, not a right. Still, I allowed the door to open slightly. Not out of longing, but out of strategy. Some truths only surface when you let people speak long enough to forget they are being observed. I wanted to see how they would rewrite history, how they would position themselves in a story where I had clearly won without them. By the time they stood close enough to see me clearly, the illusion had already begun to crack. People who leave you at your weakest often expect to find you frozen in that moment forever. They imagine time has been kinder to them than it has been to you. They assume distance erases consequences. It does not. It only delays them. When our paths finally crossed again, there was no dramatic reunion, no rush of emotion sweeping through the room. What existed instead was tension, thick and unspoken. I could feel their eyes measuring, comparing the person in front of them to the memory they had preserved. That memory no longer fit. The mismatch unsettled them. I was no longer seeking validation. I carried myself with a calm that comes only from self-sufficiency. Every choice I made, every word I did not rush to say, reminded them that they were no longer central to my story. That realization was far more painful than anger would have been. Anger can be dismissed as immaturity. Indifference cannot. They spoke of pride, of surprise, of how strong I had become. Compliments floated between us like offerings, but they were not gifts. They were attempts at alignment, ways to insert themselves into my success retroactively. If they could praise the outcome, perhaps they could forget their role in the beginning. What they did not understand was that my strength had grown in opposition to their absence, not because of any lesson they intended to teach. Every achievement I carried had been built without a safety net, without encouragement, without a fallback. Their sudden admiration felt hollow, disconnected from the reality that shaped me. I watched closely as old patterns surfaced beneath new language. There was curiosity about my finances disguised as concern for my stability. There was interest in my connections framed as pride in my ambition. There were subtle reminders of shared history, offered as proof of entitlement rather than responsibility. I did not confront them. Confrontation gives people something to push against. Instead, I maintained boundaries so smooth they mistook them for openness. I answered questions without revealing leverage. I acknowledged the past without revisiting it. I let them speak long enough to reveal what they wanted without ever asking directly. What they wanted was access. Not to me as a person, but to what I represented now. Stability. Resources. Redemption. They wanted the story to end with reconciliation because reconciliation absolves guilt without demanding repair. They wanted my success to soften the memory of their failure. But something had changed irreversibly. I no longer viewed family as an automatic bond. I viewed it as a structure built on consistency and care. Titles meant nothing without behavior to support them. Blood had proven itself to be an unreliable contract. As interactions continued, their expectations grew bolder. Suggestions replaced questions. Needs appeared where curiosity had once been. It was subtle, gradual, almost polite. That is how entitlement often enters a room, quietly assuming it belongs there. They spoke of struggles, of hardships that sounded inconvenient rather than devastating. They framed their lives as cautionary tales in need of intervention. The implication hung in the air. I had more than enough and they had less than they deserved. I felt no urge to rescue. The younger version of me might have confused obligation with love. That version might have tried to earn belonging through sacrifice. But that child had learned too early what unconditional abandonment feels like. The adult I had become understood that generosity without boundaries is self-betrayal. Still, I did not shut the door abruptly. I allowed them to believe they were rebuilding something. People reveal their truest selves when they think forgiveness is guaranteed. I wanted to see how far they would go once they felt secure again. The turning point came not through words but through assumptions. They began to speak as if my resources were communal, as if my success had closed a circle rather than redrawn it. Plans were hinted at. Expectations were floated. My life was being mentally rearranged to accommodate their return. They had mistaken my composure for compliance. There comes a point in every story of survival where restraint becomes a choice rather than a necessity. For years, silence had protected me. It had allowed me to observe, to learn, to grow without interference. But as their comfort increased, so did the risk of history repeating itself in a different form. This time, abandonment would not be physical. It would be strategic and it would be aimed at my resources rather than my body. I recognized the pattern because I had lived its consequences. Dependence had once been forced on me. Now it was being gently suggested as a virtue. They spoke of togetherness, of rebuilding what was broken, of how family should support one another. The language was warm, but the intent was transactional. Support flowed in one direction. Expectation flowed in the other. What they could not see was that my life had been built on the absence of backup plans. I had learned to evaluate risk without sentiment. I had learned that people who reappear when you succeed are often drawn by the success, not the person. That distinction mattered more than anything. I began to assert myself not through confrontation but through definition. I clarified boundaries the way one clarifies terms in a contract. Calmly, explicitly, and without apology. My time was limited. My resources were allocated. My priorities were non-negotiable. I framed my life as complete, not awaiting repair. The reaction was immediate, though carefully masked. Disappointment surfaced under smiles. Confusion appeared where entitlement had been. They had expected gratitude for their return, not conditions. They had expected access, not accountability. What followed was a subtle shift in tone. Warmth cooled. Patience thinned. Stories of sacrifice grew more dramatic, designed to provoke obligation. The past was selectively rewritten. Moments of neglect softened into misunderstandings. Abandonment reframed as tough love or unfortunate necessity. I did not correct them. I did not argue timelines or intentions. People reveal themselves more clearly when you let them explain their choices without interruption. Every revision of history was a confession disguised as justification. The true test came when assistance was implied more directly. Not asked for outright but assumed. They spoke of needs that aligned conveniently with my capacity. They referenced future scenarios where my involvement would naturally increase. The word family was used as a lever, applied carefully to see if it would move me. It did not. I had already paid the price of unconditional loyalty once. I had paid it with hunger, with instability, with years of unlearning shame that was never mine to carry. I was not willing to pay it again, especially not to people who had only rediscovered me once I became useful. When I declined to meet those expectations, the shift became undeniable. Affection thinned into formality. Interest narrowed. The effort they had made to reconnect began to feel strained, as though the return on investment was no longer promising. That was when I understood the full shape of the truth. They had not come back to know me. They had come back to claim me. And when ownership was denied, enthusiasm faded. I felt no anger, only clarity. Closure does not always arrive as an apology. Sometimes it arrives as confirmation. The child who had been left behind had spent years wondering if they had been unworthy. The adult standing now had proof that the abandonment had never been about me at all. I did not need revenge. I did not need validation. The power was already mine. I had built a life so full that their absence no longer created a void, and their presence no longer added value. By the time the distance returned, it no longer felt like loss. It felt like alignment. The space they left behind this time was not hollow or cold. It was clean. It was intentional. It was mine. Their attempts to stay connected dwindled once it became clear that my life would not bend to accommodate their expectations. Messages became infrequent, then obligatory, then non-existent. There was no dramatic fallout, no final confrontation that could be retold with flair. Just a quiet retreat, the same way they had once left me standing alone at 16. The difference now was that I was not waiting for them to come back. I watched the separation happen with a kind of detached awareness. It was familiar but no longer defining. The younger version of me might have spiraled, might have internalized the disappearance as proof of personal failure. But growth has a way of recontextualizing pain. What once felt like rejection now felt like confirmation of boundaries working as intended. I turned my focus inward, then forward. The life I had built demanded presence, not nostalgia. My work expanded not because I chased validation but because I trusted my vision. Opportunities continued to find me, drawn by consistency rather than spectacle. I invested in spaces that reflected who I had become, not who I had survived being. There was a quiet satisfaction in knowing that my success stood independent of their acknowledgement. I did not need them to see me to feel real. I did not need their approval to feel complete. The story had closed its loop without their participation. Occasionally I thought about the night I was left behind. Not with bitterness but with perspective. That moment had fractured my world, but it had also freed me from illusions early. I had learned young that security built on others can be withdrawn without warning. That lesson, painful as it was, had shaped a resilience that no comfort ever could. People often imagine revenge as a loud event, something sharp and public. But the most powerful form of revenge is irrelevance. It is living so fully that the people who once defined your pain no longer have a role in your peace. It is choosing not to repeat cycles simply because they are familiar. I did not erase them from my memory. I simply removed them from my future. There is a difference. One is denial. The other is discernment. The life I live now carries no trace of the desperation that once haunted me. It is structured, intentional, and self-authored. Every achievement is rooted in a choice I made when no one was watching. Every moment of calm is earned, not inherited. If they ever wonder what became of the child they left behind, the answer is simple. That child grew up. Not hardened, not broken, but awake. Awake to the truth that love without consistency is not love at all. Awake to the fact that survival can become strategy and strategy can become sovereignty. This story does not end with reconciliation, because not every ending requires reunion. Some endings are victories precisely because they are quiet. This has been Black Queen Dominion, where survival becomes power and power learns when to walk away.